Good morning. So, first, thank you all for coming. It's a tutorial. It's Wednesday morning. It's a little bit early. I totally get that, and thank you all for coming. So, my slide that I will put up here. My name, Matt Ringel. Whiteboarding 101. So what, and I'm with Akamai, actually. So, hello. My name is Matt Ringel. I'm one of the architects who handles global network planning for Akamai Technologies. And I want to give you a talk on whiteboarding. I realize this is very meta. We'll work from there. What we're going to talk about over the next, is this okay? Okay. What we're going to talk about over the next 90 minutes or so, and I promise there'll be a break in the middle, because I'm kind, is that how do you give a talk so that people will listen? How do you give a talk using one of these things, which is a very versatile medium? It is one of the amazing analog groupware solutions, I will have you know, to actually talk about whatever topic you want to do, make sure people listen, make sure people internalize it, and walk away knowing more, which is probably the whole reason you're up here in the first place. Certainly it's for me. So what we're not going to talk about is, we're not going to talk about sales techniques. We're not going to talk about weathering a whiteboard coding interview. There are plenty of other books that do that. I do not have to. Whiteboard coding interviews are terrifying. I understand that. That's a subject for another day. And what I hope you'll walk away with is that this is not magic. This isn't a, how did this person manage to say the right words to get the idea into my head or into other people's heads. This is about a bunch of understanding what a whiteboard is, what it isn't, some tips on public speaking, and understanding how you can actually work with your audience together to come up with a speech that actually works. And so you can take questions. Now, a couple of the ground rules. This is going to be roughly 90 minutes long. That's how long the tutorial slot is for. There will be a break in the middle, because I'm kind. And we'll do like a 5-minute break in the middle, what have you, and we'll figure that one out. In addition, there will be multiple points during this discussion where I'll stop if people have questions, they can ask questions. What I will ask, step up to the mic, because it's not about whether your voice is loud. Trust me, my voice is plenty loud. But it's so that it is recorded, so that when it goes on YouTube or what have you, other people will be able to hear. Because the only ears in this room for video are those mics. So, that being said, let's begin. Behold, the whiteboard. So, thank you. So, what is the whiteboard, right? Or what is a whiteboard talk? So you've got this graphical medium right here. Hopefully you've got functioning markers. We'll get to those in a second. But what you're doing is a bunch of storytelling. Humans think in terms of narrative. There's a beginning, a middle, and the end. It's the way that we've relayed information to each other throughout history. And what I want to show you is how you can use this medium in order to do that. In addition, we're taking a look at things like, hello, there we are. Teaching, right? Because you're not just up here to tell a cool story. I mean, I've seen them off podcast, or heard it. The point is that you're actually teaching something. You want this idea that is, language is the way that I get an idea into your head without surgery. So what I want to do is teach you. I want to make sure that this thought construct that is in my head of how to give a talk ends up in your heads. And so the important part is understanding, how do you have to order your thoughts? How do you have to think about your thoughts? And how do you make sure that the audience is following along with you? And in addition, Improvisation. So there are a few familiar faces out here for me, people I've worked with in the past or what have you, but in the end, there's a whole bunch of you I don't know, friends I haven't met yet. And what that means is that I don't know what you know. I don't know what you don't know. And so during the talk, I have to be able to read the audience, and through checking in and listening to the questions that are asked and the questions that are not asked, understanding how I have to change the talk on the fly in order to figure out what's going to get these thoughts into your heads. And that means that you're going to have to know a lot more about your topic in order to teach even a small amount of that. We'll get into that too. So what else does it mean? Structure. Once again, it's not just me telling a free-form story up here. That's what cocktail hour is for. It's about actually coming up with a beginning and middle and an end to your talk and understanding how to let people in so that you can actually set boundaries on what you want to talk about, make sure you're focusing on it, making sure you're narrowing your talk. The issue is almost never having too little to say. It's about saying too much to support the topic at hand and getting people confused and having them lose their way. So one of the other things, so as we mentioned in improv, kind of reading the room. You know, understanding, are people following you? Are people bored? Are they looking at their laptops? Are they staring at their phones? To the people who have just looked up from the laptops and looked up from their phones. And, I saw you. And crowd control. This does not mean anything violent, I promise. What this does mean, however, is how do you keep the audience focused? And the audience wants to see you succeed. The audience wants to learn. That's why they're here, theoretically. But in addition, there are kinds of things where there might be disruptive people in the audience, where they might not even believe they're being disruptive. Or you might lose the audience, or you might end up with, oh, there's like a 5-person conversation happening back there, and there's a 2-person conversation happening over here, and this person was laughing at something that they fired up on YouTube, and you can even hear the video from over there. No, really, this happened. And how do you bring people back in a way that doesn't alienate your audience? You know, I mean, I know people who have done the, like a phone rings in the audience, go, ha! And while that's funny, the first time, after that, it's just the don't make fun of your audience. So, let's start with a couple of assertions, okay? For me, the most interesting thing about a whiteboard is it allows you to turn a story into a picture. Humans are visual beings. Humans are narrative beings. A whiteboard is the way that you get that combo together into somebody's head. And that's actually extraordinarily powerful because you get to work with the things that are already in people's heads. And we'll get to that in a little bit. In addition, what it allows is for real-time organization. Because I'm putting scribblings on this board in some order, just like I put those 5 terms before. That wasn't an accident. That was the way I wanted you to think about it. And that's the way you may retain it. There will be a recording of it. You'll get to take a look at that later. There will be a few meta discussions like this. This is not to say, ha, I caught y'all, but rather just, this is part of a meta discussion on how whiteboarding is done. So, in addition, so show of hands, how many people here know the 500-mile email story? 1, 2, not many at all. Wow, okay. Let's see if I can do this in 10 seconds. Oh yeah, someone back there. So, 10 seconds. Long time ago, sysadmin realized that emails were only getting sent if they were within 500 miles of the host. And through a bunch of sleuthing, They figured out it was due to a misconfigured timeout. That was for, I think, a millisecond, and things went poorly. And so the speed of light hates you, as we all know. We're all networking people. So this is a story, and I encourage you to do a web search for 500-mile email. You will find the story. It is a fascinating story of debugging and sleuthing and blind alleys and understanding what's going on. And I'm pretty sure that you won't forget it once you read it, because it is a perfect example of the art of system administration. So that is a perfect example of narrative. So I suppose I'm giving you all homework. Do that thing. In fact, I'll write it up here. 500-mile email. I think that's 750 clicks. So I've been told to do that. So, so given that, people absorb information through stories. So how do you organize what you're doing into a story, and how do you use what they have? So before we actually get into like the mechanics of story structure and boundaries and definitions and all that, a couple of helpful safety tips. Bring your own markers. When I walked into this room, while a few of you were here, it was because I just ran down to Staples, which happened to be below this building, thank you, to get new markers, because the markers that were supplied by the hotel, the ones that I tend to use, that being black and red, didn't work. So, yeah, I know, right? So what we ended up with is ran downstairs, handed nice people $7 and got some markers. Bring your own. Also get smaller ones, because this way you get to write with a thinner line. In the case of, specifically, I know we're getting back to it, a coding interview, getting to write more stuff on the board is cool. If you're in a more intimate setting, getting to write more stuff on the board where you're actually working an idea, as opposed to teaching a lecture hall, is also an interesting idea. But get your own markers. They're cheap, they work, and you know they work, and you're not left with any surprises. So the fun thing about dry erase markers, a little bit about dry erase marker technology, is that it's basically solvent. It is pigmented solvent. That's why this works at all. This also means they dry out incredibly quickly. Cap your markers. If you are not writing with them for more than a few seconds, cap your markers. Because if you leave this thing open for more than a couple of minutes, it will dry out, and you'll end up scribbling on the board until you get it flow starting again, and you'll be embarrassed, and you will know, I should have capped my marker. In addition, when you're setting up for a whiteboard talk, if you're going to a generic office room, let's say you're going off-site to somewhere, right? Specify what you need. It's like, hey, I'm going to be doing a lot of the whiteboard. Can you make sure there are functional markers there? Because everyone's like, oh, of course there's markers in the room. Chances that they're functional? Pretty small. But if you specify before you get there, hey, can you have functional markers for me? They will show up, because people will test them and go, well, I wanted functional markers in this room anyway. Does anybody know the story of, trust me on this one, this is relevant, the Van Halen and the brown M&Ms? Okay, a few people. So band Van Halen had in their concert writer that there would be a bowl of M&Ms in the room with the brown ones removed. Now, this sounds kind of idiosyncratic and stupid, but it had a real point. Van Halen's concerts were exceedingly complex, very, very demanding from a lighting point of view. The stage had to bear a lot of weight. It had to be exceedingly well constructed. And bad things would happen, really bad things involving injury and worse, if it wasn't constructed correctly. Removing the brown M&Ms was a test of the detail that they paid attention to in the concert writer. If they found brown M&Ms in there, they knew that their roadies would have to check the entire stage setup. Similarly, if there's specific things you need, specify them. It's not bad to specify if you're coming to a talk saying, hey, I'd like a couple of bottles of water there. Hey, I'd like a couple of markers there. There's nothing wrong with imposing on people to get that done if you need to. But bring your own markers, trust me on this one. Have a couple of colors. Black shows up well, clearly. Blue, also pretty good. If you're going to use a third color, red is useful. And that tends to get around most color blindness issues. If you start using blue and green, things get weird. But the idea is that, have a couple of things so you can illustrate points. Before you come in, if you have time to access the room, walk the room. See what other people will see. In this case, we have two lovely screens that can actually show the whiteboard, so it's a little bit better. But you're not gonna have a full video setup all the time, or most of the time, really. Walk the room, see where the glare is, see where people see. You can tell people, hey, you probably want to sit over there as they come in, or they want to sit over here. So that's just basic prep. Now, if we're to talk about, let's talk about telling the story. Right? Now we're going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of what it means to actually shape a story. But before I do that, any questions on prep or background or anything like that before I continue? Great. Telling the story. So the first thing we're going to talk about is boundaries. So if you imagine, the thing that you want to talk about is going to have some boundaries around it. It's going to have some structure. You want to get a thought into people's heads. People are busy. They don't have much time. What is the thing that you can shape that you want to talk to them about? And so there are three real kinds of boundaries. There's your horizontal boundaries, which represent your scope and your time. Your scope is, what do you want to talk about? What is the thing that you want to, what do you want to cover? What is the subject of the talk? What is the context this talk exists in? Are you talking to a non-technical audience? Are you talking to a technical audience? Are you talking to a bunch of people about a subject that they have never heard about before? Or is this kind of a more advanced talk? And in addition, are you talking about the non-technical context around the issue, or are you talking about specific technical details on a paper that you're talking about? So in addition, you have your vertical boundaries, which is your level of abstraction. And that gets down to how, what is the overall view you're going to give someone this talk? Is this like a really, really nitty-gritty talk on the details of what's going on? Is this a survey of the field? Is this a 101 talk on, hey, you know nothing about this, but you're a generally technically minded person, and so we're going to just give an overview and we can dive into a couple of things if necessary, but not that many. But the thing is, once you choose that level of abstraction, say it's between here and here, stay there. Once you choose the level of abstraction for your talk, you break out of it at your own peril. If you break out too high, now you're hand-waving. And people are wondering, what are they talking about generalities? This sounds like a very, very generic talk that you could have done independent of any subject. If you break out too low, now you're stuck in the weeds. And the problem with the weeds is that they're infinite. We're all very technically minded people, give or take. If you find a technical detail that you want to go into that is fractally large, you can talk about pretty much anything within that realm, and you're going to lose people because that's not what they came to your talk to listen about. So make sure you're keeping the level of abstraction constant during the talk. And if you break out too high or too low, you will know. Not only because in your own head you're saying, maybe I'm not doing the right thing, but you're going to lose some of the audience. They'll be checking their phones, or they'll be looking at their laptops, or what have you. And they're like, I don't even know why I'm here. So, put another way, the other thing about this is the structure of the talk. What is the actual frame of this talk? For example, being able to say, and there's a few things, right? There's we found a problem, and here's a solution to it. And though NANOG, there's a problem and a solution in professional services, and buy my stuff. Or, we found a problem and there's a solution and you all should do it because I'm telling you to. Or there's, we found a problem and there's a solution, and this is a good idea and requires more research. But that is one of the things that you can set up, and that has a narrative arc, right? Here's the way the world is. Oh no, there's a problem, but there's a solution, and here's what we should do. And that's a narrative all on its own. Similarly, we made or figured out a thing. Figured out, hey, I was poking at this thing, I said, hey, that was kind of weird, and then a thing came out of it. And here's the thing that I figured out from my investigations, or my stories. It's like, we start with, well, here's the state of the world, and then in my wanderings I noticed a thing, and then I poked more, and then I figured out a thing, and here's where the new world is now. Story arc 2. Or alternately, slightly different, is the survey model, which is to say, you know, here's a whole world of things, and I looked at all of them, and here's the things that I found out about the general trend of the world based on the things, and here's new knowledge you have based on the research that I invested in getting in understanding and looking at all the things, right? That's an arc 2. But and there are many others, right? But in the end, you're talking about what are you going to cover, what layer of abstraction you're going to cover it at, and what is the overall narrative arc of the talk? What is the structure of the talk you're going to give? I will wait for 5 seconds or 10 seconds if people want to take a picture of that, and then we'll erase that and we'll continue. See people pulling out their phones. You get 5 seconds extra bonus time. It's recorded too, but you know, people want stuff. So, because video is a linear medium and nobody's going to look for the exact time that that thing was on the board. Tell me I'm wrong. So, so we talked about boundaries. What's next? So here's where we get into a little bit of fun psych stuff. So symbols. Right? Humans are very visual. They think in terms of symbols too. I mean, you can think of road signs. You think of, you know, packet diagrams, ways that you can visualize very, very abstract concepts, right? What does stop mean? Well, stop means stop moving, but how do you actually visualize stop? You know, that's a, well, it's this it's this octagon. It's not a hexagon. Really? It's this red octagon, means stop. Well, but it's like, hey, and somehow we made this bridge in our head between the concept of stopping a vehicle and a red octagon, which is kind of cool when you think about it. And so symbols are integral to what we do and how we think about the world. So if we think about it that way, one of the important things is leverage the symbols that are already in people's heads. Want to see a cool trick? Check this out. The ubiquitous 2x2 business school matrix. Everybody's seen one of these things, you know, the Gartner Magic Quadrant or things along those lines where they divide the world up into 4 squares. Well, here's the fun part about that. That represents this whole pile of assumptions about the world that if you buy into that, you immediately buy into as well. They are shaping your thoughts. Here's how the Jedi mind trick works. Ready? What have I said? There are exactly 2 axes we care about. Okay, that's number 1. Ready? So we're actually going to write these ones down. 2 axes. There are only 2 relevant points on each axis. Each of the relevant points of that axis represents an extreme. There's no midpoint in here as well. The 2 points are not here, but we're saying the 2 points are significantly different from each other. Okay. In addition, if we take 1, 2, 3, and 4, all those 4 things are also significantly different from each other. And more importantly, they're different and disjoint. But we're not done yet. Number 5, the entire world exists of these 4 classifications. Whatever scope that is being illustrated in these boxes, the entire thing is just these 4 boxes. And these are the only 4 relevant. So not only does the 4 boxes equal the world, but the 4 boxes equal all possibilities. And last but not least, that is an adequate description of the concept. So here's the fun part. I encourage you to take pictures during the talk too. It's going to stay up there for a few more minutes. So I just drew this 2x2 grid on the board. That's all I did. And yet, in general, people will pile in those 7 assumptions without even really thinking about it. Not because it's evil or weird, but just because, in general, that's the way that we'll tend to view things. Humans, brain uses a lot of energy. We try to simplify things as much as possible. And so a 2x2 grid is one of the ways we do it. But that's just one type of symbol, right? If I talk about a number line, well, what does that mean? Now I have a single axis. It might have intermediate points on it. It might not. These points represent 2 extremes. But the thing is, this isn't just about numbers, right? Let me give you something that's actually relevant to discussions that I've seen over the past couple of days. Ready? Here we go. Content wants to get closer to the user. Well, we know a couple of constraints on that. If the actual cell tower is here, we know we don't want to put servers in the cell towers because you don't get to leverage them all that much, and the CapEx and OpEx is annoying. On the flip side, you don't want to put them all the way back at the backbone because now you're backhauling that IP traffic all the way over here and then all the way back, which is the problem we're trying to solve in the first place. And so there are a bunch of companies that are springing up, I'm not going to mention any of them now, that are trying to figure out where in here you want to solve that problem. And so what did I just do? I gave you a number line. I gave you a couple of extremes. I gave you a range in here where there are no intermediate points really, although there might be depending upon your knowledge of cellular technology. And now we can have a discussion about what happens at these points along this range defined by these 2 things. And that encompasses the whole world for that talk. Other types of diagrams. Venn diagrams. There are 2 subjects. They overlap. Here's the overlap is meaningful, and here's what happens in the overlap. Or if you want to be more snide about it, you can say, there's 2 subjects and they don't overlap at all. And let me just draw 2 circles on the board. Similarly, one that's near and dear to all of our hearts, the cloud. And what does that mean? That just means someplace else the packets go to and come from. And we don't care about what they look like while they're in there. That is it's saying I'm drawing a level of abstraction on the board. One other. A bell curve. We know that this thing has a normal distribution. We know that within 1 standard deviation, we're going to find 66% of the samples, blah, 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 blah. And even if you don't know the exact numbers, you know that there's a bunch of stuff and it has a single average, and there you go. Or other things. Don't raise with your hands. Don't do what I did. Because then they get nasty and get oils on the board and it all goes bad. Exponential growth, your hockey stick graph. And it's like, hey, our business is going to succeed, and that's what our revenue is going to look like. And we don't know where we are yet. Similarly, asymptotic growth. We know that we're going to hit a law of diminishing returns somewhere around here, and we've got to try to figure out something else to do. Any number of things along those lines. And there's more complicated distributions too, but I just drew 3 lines, and you interpreted a whole bunch of things in your head about what the body of knowledge of that bunch of samples means. And I didn't have to do much. I used what you already had. So, any questions before we continue? No? So, one thing that I will recommend is, in the way that I am going to give you a little bit of homework during this talk, is think of other symbols you'd use in talks. Think of other symbols that you might want to use when you want to understand, when you want other people to understand what you're working on, either that are very, very generic or are much more domain specific, where you know that when you write this thing on the board, it's going to end up in the right person's head, and it's going to end up the way that you want it to. So, can I erase this? It seems obvious, but it's worth saying. What is the thing you want to teach? What is the thing that you want to talk about? Because here's where you have to actually think to yourself, how well do I know it? The rule that I gave back when I was in professional services days, when I had to give talks on pretty much any part of the technology that Akamai used or anything else, was you have to know 10 to teach 3. You have to know your subject 3 plus a little bit times as deep as the level you want to teach it at, because you don't know what part of that knowledge you're going to have to access in order to get the idea into the person's head. And the tricky part is because you say, well, hey, I just have to teach them what they need to know. I'm like, well, that's true, but you don't know how they're going to be able to hook it up in their own head. Like I said, I don't know a lot of you. I don't know what knowledge you're walking in with. So if there's a curveball question that's given, I need to be able to reach into a deeper pile of knowledge and come up with the answer to that question so that I can link it together in your head so that maybe you only learn 3 deep, but I had to reach down to 6 deep in order to actually get you to learn to 3 deep. Similarly, one of the interesting things about a whiteboard talk is that it's a good test of your own systemic and integrated knowledge. So to give you an idea, come up to the front, don't be shy. So if you think about it this way, you have to know how, it's not enough to kind of regurgitate the knowledge in somebody's head, in your own head, to tell it to other people. You're not relating that. For that, you hand them a bunch of slides. It's the reason that I don't like when people talk off slides, because they're not really adding value. You're saying, here's a slide deck, go get lunch, read it, and we're done. But to put it another way, you have to know how all the knowledge links together in your head so that you can talk about it as a whole system so that you can then talk about the specific things that matter. One thing that's really important is to choose your metaphors wisely. Number one, it's one thing if I have an audience here that's mostly North American. That means that I can use metaphors that are more or less applicable to North American English, and that mostly works, although that's not even true all the time. For example, let's talk about use of color, right? So, if I have, if I draw something, so if you imagine, if I draw something black on the board, and if I draw something red on the board, well, if I talk about financial stuff, That tends to be positive, and that tends to be negative. But what if I'm an electrical engineer? The symbols are exactly reversed. So, once again, know your audience and choose your metaphors, because you won't know who's in the audience. And you might be inadvertently teaching them the wrong thing, and you won't find out until they get up at the end and say, how can that possibly be true? And then you spend the next 3 minutes of their and everybody else's time realizing that you did that. Words of wisdom from the voice of experience. Similarly, check for colloquialisms during your talk. And you can do that in real time while you're talking. You know, before I used the word curveball. I'm sure a bunch of you caught that. Maybe there's one or two in the audience that, what the hell does that mean? There are odds. But that implies a knowledge of baseball that I can't assume that everybody has. In North American audience, maybe I can, but not always. And the more vocabulary that you have to hand, the more you have to think really hard about simplifying the way you talk. Because while you may think that you're speaking with precision when you're using, you know, $5 words, you're probably going to lose a chunk of your audience, because even very, very smart people don't have the exact same vocabulary and didn't learn the exact same vocabulary, because vocabulary is a function of cultural background. And I can guarantee you that y'all don't have the same cultural background. So, in fact, I'm from the Northeast US and I just use y'all. Don't ask about that. So, so once again, use what you have and what you know to get things into other people's heads. And that includes what you have around you. I have a whiteboard right here. This means that I get to draw things on the board in real time and compose things. In a more abstruse thing, and I will tell a little story here because I thought it was kind of cool, I actually had to explain to somebody the concept of hydrocarbon polymerization and cracking while in a swimming pool using pool noodles. It was fun and it totally worked. We kind of ran out near paraffin though. The idea being that use what you have and understand the medium you're working with, especially when you're talking about a whiteboard. You have markers, you have colors, you have the ability to erase, which means you can edit. You have the ability to draw things in real time and reposition them. You have the idea you can draw things in a certain order to influence things. And people can make a visual record afterwards. And people will make a visual record afterwards. So keep in mind what you draw, because you won't remember what you drew on the board. You're just given a talk. But they'll remember, and they'll have it to look at all the time. And you're probably not taking a picture of your own whiteboard while you're drawing it. That's kind of weird. So, another thing is, another example of using what you have where you are, and this is a more generic thing. You know, you're sitting at a table, you're sitting in a restaurant, you're explaining a technical thing to someone, you're saying, okay, so the salt shaker is the goalie, and the pepper shaker is the offender, and then someone tries to like explain the offside rule in soccer, and it all goes bad because you don't have enough markers to describe that. But it's just using what you have, using physical symbols to describe physical space, much like you can over here. So, given all of that, given what I've told you about boundaries and metaphors and symbols and preparation and all these other things, let's do a halftime review. And we're going to use this talk as an example. So let's look at the talk so far. What were the boundaries I established in the talk? Vertical, keep the advice practical. Things that are actionable, things that you can use. Ways that you can understand what to use. I'm not going to go into the Campbellian Uber myth or any of the other things that go into really, really deep storytelling history or the way that, you know, tales are told between humans. Horizontal, cover the medium, and cover the realities of speaking in front of people. And that's pretty much, you know, what I want to do. You have an audience, you cannot ignore them. You're not up here just to talk. You're here to interact with the audience that's here, even if it'll be later be videoed and you're never going to know who else looked at it. And the structure is based around the concept of, here's a bunch of things I learned over time and I want to give them to you. we're going to talk about effective communications and the role of narrative and a visual medium in order to do it. Preparation, walked around the room a little bit, ran down to Staples to get good markers, rehearsed up in my room, wrote a whole ton of notes. And the thing that I want to teach you, and that we're going to continue with after the break, is how to make this look easy. Because it's not difficult, but it is a skill like any other, and it requires practice. And so hopefully, by the end of this talk, you will have a good idea of how you can structure things and a good framework so you can actually think about how you want to do talks in the future. It just takes preparation. Now, what we're going to do now, and we're perfectly on time, is have a break. And you'll do about 5 minutes. How many of you here have done like community theater or anything like that? A few? Okay. So if I'm backstage and someone walks in and says, 5 minutes to curtains, how do you respond? You respond, thank you, 5. It's call and response. It's message passing. It means other people in the room get to hear. So you have 5 minutes before you come back. Excellent. So, and we're back. Oh, got a few more people. Cool. So the next part of this is about the audience. The people you are speaking to. Crowd control. So by this, I don't mean, taking care of the unruly people and dispatching them. That'll be later in this talk. We'll get to that because that's actually kind of important. But the important thing is now is how do you get people engaged with your talk? How do you start your talk? How do you end it? So the funny thing about beginning and ending talks is that it's something we do all the time. Thank you all for coming to this talk. My name is such and such. I work for such and such. Here's what we're going to be talking on. At the end of the talk, we just talked about this, a few things about the talk, blah, blah, blah. Thank you all for coming. Are there any questions? Right? Humans dig that stuff. Humans really like, I'm going to begin a talk, and I'm going to, this starts the talk, this ends the thing. Ask any spiritual leader. Humans totally dig this stuff. And it's the same thing. It doesn't matter what the context is, but telling people, we are now beginning. And you're like, oh, okay, now I'm listening to you. We have ended. Okay, now I can assimilate that data and move on with my day. And so having a definitive beginning, that's why cold opens in stuff like Saturday Night Live or stuff like that works so well, because there is no intro. You just bam right into it and you have to put yourself in. And the human's like, oh wow, things are happening. I'm in a completely new situation. You don't want to surprise people like that with your talk, typically. As you might have noticed, one of the things is give people time to take pictures of the board. This wasn't as relevant when I started giving this talk. When I started giving this talk a while ago, people either didn't have camera phones that were quite good enough from an arbitrary distance, or people didn't use their phones as ways to memorize, as ways to keep memories of things. But now that's ubiquitous, and people are going to do it all the time. And phones are fast enough that people aren't fiddling for 15 seconds waiting for their phone to figure out what day it is so they can take a picture. It's just a spontaneous thing now. So if you see people taking pictures of the board or what have you, give them a couple of seconds to do so. Because like we said, video is a linear medium. Picking out any one individual thing and scrubbing for it is something that people aren't going to do unless someone's done a lot of post-production and actually put in the index markings, which nobody does. So, by the way, a couple of bonus safety tips that were pointed out to me by a very, very good friend in the audience. One of your most useful tools, drink water. Why? Because you're throwing air out through your throat in order to talk to people. And because you're not actually having a conversation, you don't get to stop talking, which means that your throat will get dry, which means that you will begin to sound hoarse, which means that you will, after a long period of time, begin to lose your voice. If you get into a really animated conversation with somebody on an airplane, hopefully somebody who wants to have a conversation with you, you're going to find it happens very too, because an airplane is very dry. But even in a situation where we're in the middle of a rainforest here, give or take, we're still in a hotel. Hotels are very dry, because keeping a hotel dry means that it's easier to maintain the hotel. Hotel 101 for you. So given that, it's going to be very dry. Make sure you're drinking water, because you're talking constantly, and humans typically don't do that unless they're used to it. So that's number one. Notice, I downed half a liter while I was here, during the break, and this will probably be gone by the time we're done with this talk. So back to it. An agenda. Now, I'm not talking about a slide where everybody puts up the agenda at the beginning and nobody remembers it and stuff like that. What I am talking about here is know the order of the things in which you're going to talk. I think that was grammatically correct. Know the order that you're going to talk about things in. Know the order in which you want to have them and stick to that. Have an agenda. Stick to the agenda. You will know when you go into the weeds, your audience will know when you go into the weeds, and then you'll both be lost. Also, here's a little bit of a Jedi mind trick. Blame the agenda, which is to say, if during a more interactive talk, someone talks about something that's kind of off the realm of the agenda, you said, we've got a really packed agenda here, and I want to make sure that we cover everything for the good of everybody else in the room, or for the care of everybody in the room, not just you, and everybody in the room, and so we're just going to move on and we can talk about that offline. Don't blame me, blame the agenda. Works nearly every time. There will be times when someone says, no, we really need to talk about this because it's a showstopper. Obviously, do the right thing. But keep in mind that having an agenda, once again, makes people buy into the structure because it is a pre-existing artifact. It's not something you're making up on the fly because you made it up 2 minutes before the meeting. Other things. So, deferring in a talk, saying, hey, that's a great question, let's take it offline. Sounds like a fine thing to do. Realize that, in the general, just don't go over quota. It is completely reasonable to say, that's kind of outside the scope of this talk, but it's a really interesting thing, we'll talk about it later. Ain't nothing wrong with that. But if you do it constantly, people will begin to wonder why you're up there talking in the first place. And I can't tell you how many times, I can't give you a percentage. That's something that you're going to have to figure out on your own for your own talk and your own audiences. But the reality is that you will know if you start saying, because you will feel like, they're asking me a lot of stuff that I don't know about. Was this supposed to happen? I don't know. So keep that in mind if you start deferring stuff. It's okay to do, just don't do it a lot. Sorry. One of the hardest things that I had to learn, because this is one of those geek failure modes, listen to all the words of a question. When someone asks you, so here's the thing, right? Someone asks you a question, and it's about something you're very knowledgeable about. I don't know what that is, but whatever it is. And you hear the first 3 words of the question, you immediately slot into your mind, they're asking you about this. I even know the question they're asking about this, because you've run a very complicated probability function in your head that always comes up with the right answer, right? and oh, this is what they're going to ask about, and you have completely stopped listening to the actual question that they have asked. And that's a problem. Because now you have answered the question that you asked, which you knew about, which is comfy, but doesn't actually help the person who asked the question. So no matter how good you are, no matter how knowledgeable you are, no matter how experienced you are, listen to all of the words of the question that is being asked every time. You don't know what they don't know, you don't know what they ask. And it is the easiest way to trip up, and as a word of caution, it's a very easy way to look arrogant. One of the quickest ways I have seen sales engineers and professional services people and salespeople lose a sale is by somebody asking a useful, worthwhile, non-snarky, non-sarcastic, genuinely informed question, and the salesperson being so enthusiastic to show off their knowledge, or professional salesperson, or someone's, with all levels of technicality, answering a question that had precisely nothing to do with what was actually asked. And then you sound like you're keeping to your script, and you're trying to sell something as opposed to inform the customer. And then it all goes bad because then the customer stops listening to you. Or your audience stops listening to you. Or your friend stops listening to you. That is all the personal advice I'm giving here. So, but you get the idea. Listen to all the words. Other things? Notice how I inserted something in importance and left space for it? So choose 3 proxies. I can't make eye contact with every single one of you. There's too many of you to do that. There's too many of you to do it meaningfully, and that would take up too much CPU while I'm giving this talk. But what I have done is chosen 3 of you in the audience. There's the person on the left, there's the person near the center, and there's the person near the right. And those people change over time. But I'm really only looking at 3 people over any given period of time, and I'm shifting my eyes between them, because if I look in your general direction, you assume that I'm looking at you, because we're human and we do that. So it also gets me a read. Is, Mr., Mrs., or what have you left board, center board, right board? Okay, that whole side is bored. Are they attentive? Are they looking at their laptops? Are they doing something else? That is a way to actually just get a quick read of the room without spending a lot of CPU to do it. And if you switch those people every so often, A, you'll get a different read, which is good, but B, practically everybody in the room will look like you're actually looking at them. Practically everybody in the room will think you're looking at them, which over the course of the talk is probably true, but it's not true at any given point in time. And also, one of the other things you might notice doing this talk is just checking in. Are there any questions? Do you understand what I'm talking about? You're like, okay, you're not in the audience or what have you. Or you look at people and are like, I don't know why I'm here, which happens occasionally. But just asking for questions, figuring it out, checking in, making sure people are following you. If they ask questions where they're completely off base, giving a chance to adapt and work from there. So before we go on to the next part, which is words of caution, which we'll get to, which starts against some of the more fun stuff, are there any questions? Are we basically following? You're nodding, that's great. So, things that will happen during the talk. Things that I really don't want you to do during your talks, because it will make you sad and it will make your audience sad and you'll feel horrible and it will haunt your dreams. You are the expert until proven otherwise. People want you to succeed. Why are you the expert? Because you're the one at the front of the room. You're one who, by whatever meeting was decided, it's either a work meeting or sitting around a bar, or you're giving a talk and they accepted your talk, you're the one at the front of the room, and therefore you are the expert on the subject. And that's just kind of the way that works by fiat. until proven otherwise. They want to believe you're knowledgeable because you're at the front of the room. You clearly wouldn't waste their time, would you? But once they doubt that, you will not get them back. Once the switch flips from, okay, this person's really knowledgeable and I'm learning a whole bunch of things, to, I don't know why I'm here. They're talking. There's words coming out of their mouth, but I'm not sure what that means. And I've got better things to do with my time. Then you're not getting them back, short of like a pyrotechnic show. And don't do that in a hotel, things burn. So one of the other things that you have done by standing up here is that you have made an implicit promise that you will inform people and that you're not going to waste their time. You're at a conference, you're attending talks, that's kind of one of the things you do here. But there are other talks you could be at. There are other meetings you could be having. There's probably some espresso you could be drinking, I've heard. But in the end, you're making a promise to not waste people's time and stick to that promise, because it's important. The biggest thing, so if you come away from this talk with one thing and one thing only, it's the following. That. Don't make stuff up. If that is the only thing you learn from this talk, and you internalize it, and you understand why it is important, and the mechanics of why it's important, I'm happy. Because this is the most important thing I will teach you today. Now, let me give you an example. I'm giving a talk. I'm giving a talk on a subject I'm very knowledgeable about. Somebody asked me a question. I am 100% certain of the answer. And so I answer them. Gold star. You've answered a question that you were 100% certain about, and you knew to give them the right answer. Sounds great. But then there's the follow-on question, which goes a little bit deeper down that path. And maybe that's something that you looked at a few days ago or maybe a week ago, but it's generally well-known knowledge and you're 95% certain. Well, those are still pretty good odds, and nobody expects you to be perfect, and you don't expect yourself to be perfect, and 95% is a pretty good odd. Say, answer them too. And then the next follow-on question happens. It's even deeper into the weeds. And maybe that's something that you checked on a couple of weeks ago, or you heard about, or you remember talking to in passing at a conference. But now you're feeling pretty good about yourself because you've just answered 2 questions. You've gotten 2 gold stars. You want to go for 3. But now you're 75% certain. But the problem is humans want to be consistent, and you have convinced yourself you're an expert. So now you're going to answer anyway with 75% certainty, and you may sound just as certain as when you answered questions 1 and 2. And now there's a sizable chance that you're going to give a wrong answer. And that's bad for 2 reasons. Number 1, you gave a wrong answer, and you didn't even know that you did it until you get back to your desk, the glow has worn off, and you're like, oh my God, that was bad. I should send mail. I should retract that. Oh, I don't know what to, oh, there's this other thing I got to work on. But even worse, somebody who trusted you because you're the expert in the room, because you're at the front of the table, is going to act based on information that you were certain about and that you were wrong about. And they're going to find out, and now your credibility is shot, and you're never even going to know until months or years later when you find out that you have no credibility in this domain because this person went to this place and this place. Like, oh yeah, they gave me horrible information a long time ago. That is the thing that bad reputations are made of. And that was just one moment of believing your own press. Do not make stuff up. Constantly check what you're talking about. If you say something in a talk, do some casual fact-checking your talk before you say it. Many people can hear many things on the internet, and we all do, and we're all guilty of saying something, well, I heard it on the internet, and I heard it 3 times on the internet, and so therefore it's true. And none of that makes it true. I'm not saying that you have to do a 1.5 years of sourcing of every fact check that you've done. There is a limit to what one can do. But do not make stuff up if there's any way that you can be certain of something else. All right? Other things. So if I say, show of hands, if I use the term technical debt, how many people know what I'm talking about? About half of you. The idea that technical decisions you make that will come to bite you later. Things that might have been the right thing at the time, but now are going to cost you a lot more time in the future. So if you put a parking lot on the board, if you put like a little corner of the board saying, hey, you know, that's a great question. You asked me about cucumbers, I'll write cucumbers in there. And I'll get back to you on cucumbers later. Whole cucumber situation. Well, now you've made a promise, and that promise takes time and energy. And the more things that you decide to defer by saying, I'll get back to you, the more time and energy you have to take after your talk to explain things that may not even have been relevant to your talk. Why on earth in a talk about whiteboards am I talking about cucumbers? As an example. So while the idea of, hey, that's a good thing, I'll get back to you on that, is a fine thing to say, if you scope your talk correctly, you minimize the risk of that. So make sure that, you know, having a parking lot, there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure you're not using it. Don't go over quota. Other things. If you feel like you're going into the weeds, if you feel like I've gone down this path that is talking about stuff that is completely irrelevant to the thing at hand, take a breath. Just step back saying, you know, that's a really interesting topic, and I'm sure that people would find it fascinating. Let's get back to the topic at hand. Nobody is going to be mad at you if you decide to realign yourself with the talk and you say, hey, you know, that's cool. I find that stuff fascinating. We're all human. Let's get back to things. And they will appreciate it because you retain the information again. You retain their attention again. And we'll be happy you let them back in. No cucumbers. Pitfalls during a talk. Right? What are things that we all tend to do as people that tend to get us in trouble when we're giving a talk to people? One of them is what I like calling knowledging. Hey, I know all this stuff about networking. I want to talk to you all about networking, so I'm going to give this talk on this thing, and then I'm going to talk about all these other random things that I happen to know about networking because we're all like networking people and we're all bonding. Leave the random talk. This is a structured talk. That means sometimes, and it's fun to talk about the stuff that you know. But leave the stuff that you're talking, make sure that your talk is structured. If you're just doing an unstructured talk, leave that for the cocktail hour. Leave that for something where you're having random stories. Otherwise, you're going to lose people. Don't just dump information at them, because if you dump information at them, it's not going to be structured. You're going to lose them, and especially if what you do is impart information onto them. Don't make stuff up. Gotta say that one more time. Do not make stuff up. If you can, leave out irrelevant details. So this happened to me on Thursday. Who cares? Unless it is something where Thursday is particularly relevant to the situation, odds are, if you leave in that detail, you will be compelled to think about, well, maybe it was Friday. Was it Thursday? It was Friday? Oh no, it was Wednesday afternoon. I have now just wasted 10 seconds of your time arguing with myself about what day something happened. Don't do that. Just leave it out. If you don't know and it's not relevant, leave it out. Don't make it up, because then people want, hey, but you said that was Thursday. Wasn't it on Friday? Now I can't believe anything that you said. And because putting in irrelevant details adds risk. So just don't do it. Another thing that happens, I can hear you. Defensiveness. A question is not a personal affront, in general. There are a few people who are exceptions to this rule, but in general, questions are not supposed to be personal affronts of, I have no idea what you're talking about, you will now answer to me. It's someone who genuinely has a question about what you were talking about. They were engaged. Take that as an opportunity to actually clarify what you're talking about. Hey, someone really wants to know. They actually listened. That's kind of great. Do something about it. And so if you get defensive, number one, you're probably not going to answer their question, because defending yourself and answering their question are typically disjoint. You're not actually going to be able to answer their question if you're busy trying to defend your own position. And then they feel weird, and you feel weird, and everybody in the audience is like, what the hell is going on here, except for the couple of people going, a fight, this is great. Just ignore them. So, and then similarly getting bogged down in questions. And this relates into knowledging. Because it's the, hey, well, we've got all these questions. Okay, well, let's go down this rabbit hole. And then people ask all sorts of questions down this rabbit hole. And now you're wasting time during your talk trying to answer this one very narrow thing that completely breaks outside the scope of what you actually wanted to talk about. Similarly, breaking the flow of the talk. So, it's one thing to encode an idea into a story. It's another thing to actually say, hey, let me tell you a few war stories up here. Unless that's what your talk is about, don't do it. Because nobody really wants to hear them, because nobody has the context to do anything about them. Similarly, aimless meandering during a talk. If you jump from topic to topic, you are the only one who lives in your brain. Last time I checked. You're the only one who lives in your brain, therefore you will not know how other people link subjects together. So what sounds like a completely logical thing to you about how to link stuff together in your brain will sound completely like random jumping to everybody else. So make sure that you're actually, even though it might sound like, oh, why do I have to spell this out for everybody? And the answer is you have to spell it out for people because you are not in their head and they are not in yours. So, any questions before I continue? No, great. Please go to the mic. The mic is the mic is the room's ears.
If you're in the audience and you see that going that way, and the presenter has no idea that they need to reel it in, how do you get them to reel it in?
So you're at a disadvantage there. It's true. So if you see that in the audience, what are you going to do about it? Well, the tricky part is it's not on you to do, right? It's very much one thing you can do from the audience, and like I said, your leverage is pretty limited, is to actually ask a question that brings them back onto the topic at hand. Saying, hey, I wanted to get back to the core question here. Can you tell me about something? Now that means you have to come up with a question that does it, but that will gently guide the speaker back if you believe that is happening. However, if the speaker's why are you dragging me back there? No, I meant to do that. Realize that you might get pushback as well. But especially when frequent questioners act, that is a dynamic between the speaker and the audience. Just realize that the speaker has a lot more power in that situation. That answer your question? Great. So we're coming to the end, so now we get to the fun part where you get to snicker and sneer at people. Problem audiences and problem people. So How many of you know the science fiction author John Scalzi? Okay, a couple. So he came up with, very, very clever guy, came up with this acronym, which sounds like it's Klingon actually, but you know. NACMOC. So what does that mean? That's actually an acronym. It stands for not a question, more of a comment. You see where I'm going with this. So, you know, you've got the people who come up to the speaker and say, well, you know, this isn't really a question, but I want blah. Or, you know, would the panel agree with blah, 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 blah. Or alternately, well, I was wondering if and whatever they say next is completely irrelevant because they just wanted to get on their soapbox and say whatever they wanted to say. And it will not interest anybody in the room. And so if you're a speaker or if you are a panel moderator, just cut them off. Really, you'll be doing a service to everybody in the room. Like, you know, and I know that's what's on those signs over there too. Make sure you're actually asking a question. It's the hey, you know, that sounds like much more of a comment than a question. We can talk about that offline. Is there a specific question you wanted to ask? As an example. Or can you phrase that in the form of a question? For those more game show oriented. Or alternately, it's like, let's talk about that later. That doesn't sound terribly relevant. What does the next person have to say? Or if you have a good and cordial relationship with the sound people, have them cut the mic. So, I'm not kind about that kind of thing, but that's one of the quickest things that will derail a conversation, derail a talk very, very quickly for no good reason. And because you're speaking to, if you're the speaker, you're speaking to an audience. But if they're up there and they're doing the knock-mock thing, they're only speaking to you. And they may not even realize that. They don't realize the rest of the audience exists. They think that's a conversation between the two of you. And that means everyone else is locked out. Similarly, one thing that happens is the sniper. There's the person who, while you're giving a talk, they're in the audience and they're saying snide remarks to their friend about the talk. Yeah, like that's actually how it works. He has no idea what he's talking about. In a large group like this, in a larger group, not a big deal, because you could probably hardly hear them and they're not going to be terribly disruptive. However, in a smaller group, if they keep making side comments, the answer is to expose and isolate. Tommy, do you have something you'd like to share with the rest of the class? That's what that is. Expose, isolate. The person wants to be able to say what they want to say without drawing attention to themselves. They want it both ways. That's what a sniper does. And this way you deprive them of both. You have now deprived them of their anonymity, and you've now drawn the attention completely on them. So, and that is the quickest and most effective way. And really, you've seen it all since when you were in elementary school with Tommy. Would you care to share that with the rest of the class? And a grown adult who does the same thing deserves the same amount of respect. Which is to say, not very much at all. The bully. The person who, for whatever reason, gets very, very aggressive up at the mic. You know, so just to test that you know what you're talking about, tell me more about this. And they're like, just let it hang there. Just wait them out. A lot of the time, someone is actually having a mimetic immune response. It's like, that can't possibly be true. Now prove yourself to me. And if you just let them burn, and if it's I'm sorry, is there a question there? And you let them keep talking, and eventually they burn themselves out. And they'll kind of say, they'll ask some innocuous question just so they don't feel completely embarrassed at the mic. Or they'll say, or they'll kind of just trail off and you'll be able to continue. But basically, by not giving them anything to push back on, by not giving them the response they want, especially as your power as the speaker, you get to actually move on quickly. And last but not least, the status seeker. Hello, I'm here at the podium to show that I'm the smartest person in the room. Or I'm at the mic to show that I'm the smartest person in the room. And I will show that by asking an intelligent and incisive question that may or may not have anything to do with what you are actually talking about. But I want to show that I am smart because I didn't get enough love in my childhood. And, you know, I can't say that's the actual reason that's happening, but it's possible, right? That's psychotherapy for another, I'm sure there's another tutorial. Point is that there are people like, I will ask a really interesting and incisive question, and I didn't actually listen to anything that was said during the talk, because this is a soapbox that I've wanted to stand on forever. This occasionally combines with NANOG, in that way of the, well, also, it's like, here's this really incisive question, and I just want to say that you're wrong. Because I must be the important person in the room at the time. Because I feel bad about not being the important person in the room because I'm the one, the speaker, because that's not what happened. And so this actually has a bunch of all of these, right? They want to actually just make a statement. They don't actually want to ask a question. They don't want the attention brought on them. They just want to kind of throw a grenade and run away. They want to show that they are the dominant person in the room, that they are the smart person, and draw the attention to them, all to make sure that the rest of the audience thinks it's all about them. In that case, the smartest thing to do is, and this will make you feel sad, but it's true, is to recognize and defer, which is to say, you know, that's a really, really good point. I'll be glad to talk with you about that offline. You have now recognized them, which indulges the fact that they want to be seen as smart. And by deferring it, you get to find out whether they actually had a question in the first place. Because I will tell you, from experience, 95% of the time, they're never going to come up to you and ask that question. They just don't care. They just want to be recognized for whatever reason that they talk about with their therapist. And there you go. So that's the talk in a nutshell. We have 5 minutes and 52 seconds left, according to the clock down here. And so in conclusion, this is a really, really useful method for getting information across. You get to tell things in order, positioning them in different ways. You get to get symbols into people's heads. You get to have a boundary of a talk that actually gives you an idea to tell symbols. The story that you tell, the story that you're able to tell on the whiteboard, this becomes a constant reference for you to look back at so that you can actually keep the story structure straight in your head. And it gives something that gives people a persistent visual reminder of what's going on that they will take pictures of nowadays. So it's a really effective tool. I hope you've learned something about this. I hope you've learned something a little bit more about how to give a talk on whiteboard, what makes sense, and what doesn't make sense, and also how to guide audiences so you can actually get your point across. And this scales from one person who's in a room with themselves, sorting out their own thoughts on a whiteboard, to me, talking in front of you. If you have any further questions, I'll be around all day. So if you have any questions, you want to send email, ringle@akamai.com, or on Twitter, @Ringle. And I hope to hear from a few of you. So, that being said, any questions?
Alyssa Moore, Canadian Internet Registration Authority. Do you have any strategies for engaging your audience, especially with smaller groups where you really need their input to finish your talk?
That's a good question. How do you build engagement with an audience? quickly, preferably. This goes back to something I said a little bit earlier in the talk, invocation. Thank you all for coming this morning. What was the first thing I did when I got up here, when we started the talk? Good morning! And part of that is that really just, hey, it's kind of early right after the social, and why did you do that to me? But part of that is saying, we are starting now. And if you say, we are now beginning this talk, in whatever way, it's either, good morning, I'm glad you all made it, there's a lot to cover today, here we go. And that settles people into this agentic state, where they're like, I am an agent, I am being taught things, and I'm ready to go. And similarly, at the end of, and then when I hit the break, it's like, okay, we're now gonna take a break for 5 minutes, and come back, and then we'll go. And it's like, okay, now I've got some time, I can breathe, I come out of the agent state, I get to come back to it and make it go. And then when I go back in the clock, okay, and we're, an anchorman on TV, and we're back. The newscast starts again. Or at the end of this talk, thank you very much for coming. I hope you learned a lot of stuff. Here's the way to get in touch with me. Do you have any questions? And now they flip out of the agent state again, and they ask questions. So it's really put the demarcation points in, and that will get you a long way towards getting the engagement quickly and effectively and immediately.
Andrei Khomikov, Athena Health. In the
Can
beginning,
you get a little bit closer to the mic? I'm sorry.
Andrei Khomikov, Athena Health.
Thank you.
In the beginning, you talked about structure and the scope and abstraction levels. Do you normally come up with that before you then kind of fill in the blanks, or you come up with the talk and then you kind of like build a structure around it? Like basically, do you do the framing before or after or during maybe preparing your presentations?
In general, I will attempt to get most of that done before a talk starts, before I walk into the room with people. With the knowledge that I may have to adjust it, I may have to fine-tune it on the fly. But in the end, I have, this is how I'm going to talk to people about the subject. And depending upon how the receptive I might have to change the structure a little bit. But my scope probably isn't going to change unless I completely misread the room. And my abstraction level isn't going to change. So that's all pre-prep I do. So the short answer is, most of that is pre-prep with the acknowledgement that you may have to fine-tune once you're there. But you don't want to completely re-rig the talk once you're there, because you won't have prepared for it. And if you try to do it, it's a train wreck. People will lose the plot, and they won't come back to you, and they just won't know where to associate themselves with that talk.
And that makes sense. That's not quite the gist of my question, though. What I wanted really to know is, when you prepare in the content of your talk, before you present it, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. When you prepare the content of your talk, like you first select the topic, like overarching view, maybe a structure, and then you kind of fill in the gaps, the content, or maybe you just write down the narrative and they're like, well, let me actually summarize it into a topic.
So my personal process, and your mileage may vary. My personal process is I will take the content, I know the thing that I want to teach, and then I will think of the audience, just saying, okay, what level of abstraction do I need to be at? How much time do I have, which dictates my scope? And depth, clearly. And with the knowledge of the audience I have, then I'll start putting a structure around it, saying, here's the narrative structure that I think is going to work for this audience. So it's typically content, then scope, then narrative.
Okay. And a different question, perhaps not about whiteboarding, but in the modern world of, what are they called, web conferences?
Sure.
Do you have any suggestions about presenting to a virtual audience?
So it depends. If you're a disembodied voice, so I will tell you, speaking over slides is deadly. The only thing more deadly is speaking over basically a recording of someone speaking over slides. I don't know anybody who can actually pay attention to that for any period of time. Sometimes that's the reality of the world. The reason that a talking head is interesting in that regard is because you get to actually see the emotion, you get to see how they're talking, and because they know they're being filmed, they will be engaged. If you are a disembodied head, or say if you're not a disembodied head, if you're just a voice, a disembodied voice, If it's during a real-time conference, check in with people more often. Don't leave all your Q&A for the end. That will be a disaster. If you need to, because there's actually a lecture you're giving, saying, I understand that people are going to have questions. Please put them in chat and hold them to the end. Please hold them in chat and we'll answer them at the end. However, that's not going to work all the time because that question they're asking may be instrumental to them understanding the rest of your talk. So make sure that there are breakpoints. Like if your subject has like 3 big parts to it, at the end of each part, saying, let's take a few of the questions and go on. And especially by putting them in chat, there's a very specific enumerated amount of questions, and then you can move on so you're not losing too much pacing. But really, during a virtual conference, split your talk into parts, check in at the end of each part, make sure that people will know they get their questions answered at the end of each part, encourage them to put them into chat when they come up with them, so that people don't completely lose it, because if you don't get to a question and they lose comprehension, they'll just leave the conference if it's a lecture. Or they'll go back to checking their mail and you'll never know.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
It's Marilyn Hay from Van IX and VCNet. You touched on vocabulary. I have a question around using acronyms and how you handle that.
So, there are a lot of problems with using TLAs, clearly.
Yes.
A lot of it is, and it's tricky, especially in the networking world where you're stuck with acronyms all the time. To some extent, that's just gauging the audience. For example, this is NANOG, and I say, does everybody know what TCP is? Well, now I look like a moron. So, or at least very unperceptive. So you kind of have to walk in with a base level of knowledge of what people understand. Is this an industry organization where they're going to understand the basic internet concepts? But even then, you can wander a little bit far afield, right? Most people in this room have probably heard the term VXLAN, and they can spell it, but they may not know exactly what it is, exactly how it works. They may not have used it operationally, and so you may have to expand that to actually give them an idea of what it is. That is more about really knowing your audience. And you'll see when you lose people. But the tricky part is, much like in any kind of legal document, right? You expand it once, say, this is the acronym we're using, and then you move on. Okay. And just choose the ones you're going to reference a lot and just get them into the earliest part of your talk as quickly as possible, so then you can move on with the rest of your talk.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Anything else? Great. Thank you very, very much for coming. If you have any questions, right out there. Hope to talk to you soon. Have a great rest of your NANOG.